Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let us begin the second session of today's conference. With former Ambassador Choi So-kyung to the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Korea in Geneva as a moderator, the second session will proceed under the topic of Is the World Economic Order Under Duress? We will have Professor Julia Chin at Wayne State University and Director Dan Atkinson of Cato, Harvard, and A. Stifel Center for Trade Policy Studies as presenters for the second session. Last but not least, I would like to invite Professor An Tok-gun of International Trade Law and Policy at Seoul National University and Professor Choi Byung-il at Ewha Women's University as discussants. So, ladies and gentlemen, please let us welcome our panelists on the stage with a big round of applause. Thank you very much, and now I will hand over the microphone to Ambassador Choi So-kyung.
Good afternoon. This morning we spent quite actually a very interesting time to discuss the issues of fourth industrial revolution and its implications on geopolitics and diplomacy in recent years. The second session would focus on the fourth industrial revolution and its implication on global trade order. The trade and investment issues have become one of the prominent agenda items in international system, and the globalization and the liberalization of trade has changed the patterns of trade dramatically. We have seen ever complex nature of global value chains and the changes of the patterns of trade in services and investment, and more importantly, the development of the digital trade in recent years have been a new phenomenon in this world. On the other hand, globalization and the liberalization of the trade has exacerbated inequalities and also the protectionism around the world. Against this backdrop, we also have witnessed the growing tensions between United States and China for the competition of the tariff escalations. And we have seen the temporary agreement between US and China in Buenos Aires last week for ceasefire for 90 days. And then they would enter into discussions on how to resolve the current tensions. And all these issues is leading to the question of the multilateralism. These changes, how these changes would affect multilateral trading system, and how we can respond to these changes. In fact, in Geneva, WTO is discussing how to reform the WTO. Many countries, including European Union and Canada, and other countries also joined, proposed reform proposals. But this proposal is just the beginning of discussions. We don't know yet what would be the final outcome. And also the response strategy to these changes is also very complex. We have now 4 prominent scholars around the world, 2 from United States and 2 from Korea. I would like to invite 2 presenters, Julia Chin and Dan Atkinson, for presentation for 20 minutes each. And thereafter, I will invite discussants, Professor An and Professor Choi, for 10 minutes for discussions and comments. Thank you. I invite Julia Chin.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Choi. It's my great honor to be here making this presentation to the audience. The focus of my presentation is on the legal challenges presented by data and then data flows to the multilateral trading system. As we all know, data flow is the lifeblood of the fourth industrial revolution. Whether it is artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, Internet of Things, cloud service, data and data transfer are at the heart of the new digital economy. It has been suggested, this morning keynote speaker also mentioned, data now is a new factor of production. It is the raw material for the production of all products, whether tangible or intangible. In the digital era, the traditional factors of production, such as labor, land, actually have decreased in importance in comparison. According to one estimate, in 2015, the value of cross-border data flows surpassed the value of world merchandise for the first time. Data flows in their natural state do not recognize national borders. This was the general state of affairs in the early days of the internet, the World Wide Web, and cloud computing. The internet is a global network based on the protocol of interconnecting computers. Information is routed across this network automatically and autonomously by choosing the most efficient path most of the time, without regard to national borders. In recent times, however, national governments have increasingly exerted their control over data flow. The government restrictions fall into two types. The first is restrictions on the inflow of data from abroad. The most prominent example is the Great Firewall of China. As many of you probably know, inside China, one cannot use Google services, access Facebook, follow Twitter, watch YouTube, or use Dropbox, unless you have a special version of VPN. The second type is the restrictions on outflow of data, which is relatively more recent phenomenon. It's also known as data localization requirements. For example, the government may prohibit data generated inside the country from leaving the country without government approval. Or the government may require business to store and process data on computer servers located inside the country only. According to one OECD survey, as of 2017, at least 68 countries have adopted more than 100 measures on data flow, including more than 40 on local storage. It has been reported, I know this yesterday, that Korea actually is considering whether to require Google to have local servers in Korea so that Google will be subject to Korea income tax. This is also a kind of data localization requirement. Government interest in restricting data flow can be divided into two general categories. One is based on non-economic public policy considerations, such as to protect the privacy of individuals, protect the consumers from fraudulent activities, or to protect the public morals, maintain public order, and protect national security. The most prominent example of privacy concerns is the EU General Data Protection Regulation, which took effect in the summer of this year. The regulation applies to all businesses processing personal data of EU residents, regardless of whether the businesses are located inside or outside the EU. Non-compliance with the regulation may subject a company to severe fines, up to 4% of annual global revenues or 20 million euro, whichever is greater. Korea actually provides interesting example of national security concern. As many of us know from outside this country, Google Map does not work properly in this country. That is because Korean law prohibits foreign companies from using Korean map data on the grounds of national security due to the lasting conflict with North Korea. The second type of government interest in controlling data is based on economic policy objectives. The data flow restrictions can protect domestic industries from foreign competition. For example, Baidu, the Chinese search engine, has benefited greatly commercially from the absence of Google in the Chinese market. The data localization requirements will make it more expensive, costly for foreign companies because it requires them to maintain local servers in each country of their operation. While national governments may have legitimate reasons to regulate data flow, their measures can have negative impact. When government measures interfere with natural flow of data, they will not only increase the cost of doing business, but also impede the development of new technologies, such as cloud computing, which needs to operate efficiently in the borderless cyberspace. Government measures to nationalize data and data flow will seriously limit the potential benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. So the question is, can the multilateral trading system help? Unfortunately, the institution underpinning the multilateral trading system, which is the World Trade Organization, is currently in crisis. First of all, starting in the spring this year, the United States has been engaged in trade wars with China over intellectual property issues and with many other countries over steel and aluminum. These trade wars have been fought in breach of WTO norms, but the WTO has not been able to stop them. Second, the WTO dispute settlement system is under duress. The United States has blocked appointments and the reappointments of judges to WTO appellate body, which may soon paralyze the mandatory dispute settlement mechanism. Third, the WTO has not been able to conclude any major agreements in more than 2 decades because it's been practically impossible for the 160-some members to reach consensus. But there are also some encouraging developments recently. The G20 leaders have just adopted a declaration which specifically mentioned their joint commitment to rule-based international order, their support for WTO reform, and their support for the free flow of information, ideas, and knowledge in the digital economy. I will now turn to the legal challenge, which is the need to update WTO rulebook. The WTO basic principles are exceedingly powerful and should be equally applicable to new issues arising from the fourth industrial revolution. These basic principles are reduction of trade barriers, non-discrimination in international commerce, transparency in government measures affecting trade. But WTO rules are also outdated for the digital economy. As an initial matter, it is unclear how data and data flow should be characterized. Under current rules, trade is divided into trade in goods and trade in services. And the two types of trade are regulated very differently. The traditional distinction between goods and services, however, has become blurred in the digital economy. Here's an example. Is a blueprint fed into a 3D printer for delivery in another country, trade in good or trade in service? Here are the major WTO agreements that are most relevant to digital trade, and they were all made in the 1990s. The WTO has an e-commerce program beginning in 1998, but it remains to be work in progress. The most significant WTO agreement concerning data flow is the General Agreement on Trade in Services, or GATS, because many data-based activities are also data-based services. Here is how GATS is designed. Its basic approach is to divide cross-border supply of services into 4 modes and classify all services into 12 sectors and numerous subsectors. Data transfer may be involved in any of the service sectors and in different modes. The GATS obligates WTO members to 1, open up their domestic markets to foreign services, and 2, to accord national treatment to foreign services. However, a member's obligations with respect to these two aspects are limited only to the specific commitments inscribed in its service schedule. Each member has a service schedule, and the level and extent of specific commitments vary from one member to another. All legal obligations under the GATS are subject to public policy exceptions. They include specifically public morals, public order, public health, the privacy of individuals, and consumer protection, national security. But there are serious limitations in the application of GATS to data flow. One limitation is the low level of specific commitments of WTO members in data-intensive sectors. According to WTO statistics, for example, more than 40% of members have not made any commitments on cross-border computer and related services in their schedule. Another problem is outdated classification of services. New services such as search engines, cloud computing, social media, mobile apps did not exist in the early 1990s when GATS classification was adopted. The WTO recognized the principle of technology neutrality, which means a particular service may be supplied through any technology available, including newly developed technologies. However, the application of this principle is not without limits. At some point, it would become unreasonable and politically difficult to require the members to accept qualitatively different new technologies under the old classification. Now, while the WTO has failed to reach new agreements, many WTO members have entered into free trade agreements with each other on either bilateral or multilateral basis. These FTAs aim at a higher level of trade liberalization, and many have adopted new rules in keeping up with the technological development, and we can call them WTO plus rules. For example, the US-Korea bilateral FTA, KORAS, concluded in 2012, has a chapter on e-commerce, which contained the most advanced rules on digital trade at the time. The more recent and most significant multilateral FTA is the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, or TPP, which was concluded among 12 countries of different economic development levels and different economic systems. The TPP has a chapter on e-commerce that has many more detailed provisions than KORAS. After the United States withdrew from the TPP, the 11 remaining countries have decided to implement the agreement among themselves. These 11 countries are Mexico, Canada, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Vietnam, Brunei, Peru, Chile, and Malaysia. And the new agreement has been renamed as a Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, which will take effect on December 30th this year. Meanwhile, the United States has renegotiated NAFTA with Mexico and Canada. The NAFTA 2.0, or USMCA, contains a chapter entitled Digital Trade, which has further refined the TPP rules on e-commerce. In addition to FTAs, a group of 20-some similarly minded WTO members, including Korea, have been negotiating a new service agreement since 2013, which are expected to include many new rules on digital trade. One contribution these new FTAs made is the introduction of the concept of digital product. A digital product is defined as a computer program, text, video, image, sound recording, or other product that is digitally coded, produced for commercial sale or distribution, and that can be transmitted electronically. This definition covers digital data. These agreements also take care to say that this definition of digital product does not reflect the views of the parties on whether digital products should be considered a good or service. Another contribution of the FTAs is the articulation of general principles on digital trade. One principle is non-discriminatory treatment of digital products produced anywhere by any person. This is in contrast with the limited scope of national treatment under GATS. The other principle is the freedom in cross-border transfer of information for the conduct of business, subject only to necessary and reasonable public policy safeguards. Take the CPTPP as example. This agreement contains major obligations on data transfer. It provides that each party shall allow cross-border transfer of information by electronic means, including personal information for the conduct of the business. On data localization, it specifically provides that no party shall require the use or location of computing facilities in its territory as a condition for conducting business in its territory. Note that computing facilities are defined as computer servers or storage devices for processing or store information. Under this agreement, a party may depart from these obligations for legitimate public policy objective, but it may not impose restrictions greater than are required to achieve the objective or in an arbitrarily or unjustifiably discriminatory manner. The effect of TPP rules can be readily observed when we compare Vietnam, which is a party to the CPTPP, with China, the two countries that have similar political and economic system. Vietnam's new cybersecurity law does not require foreign service providers to maintain a server in Vietnam, although it does require all online services to store data of Vietnamese citizens for a period prescribed by the government. The law does not prohibit such data to be exported after such a period. In contrast, China's cybersecurity law requires all personal data and important data, which is an undefined term, generated domestically be stored in China. Transferring data abroad is allowed only when it's truly necessary for business reasons and after security assessments are conducted according to government rules. The most critical issue in cross-border data transfer is how to strike a proper balance in government regulation. In my view, the proper standard for striking such a balance should be necessity. That is, the government restriction must be necessary to achieve legitimate public policy objective. In this regard, a test of necessity developed under WTO law is very helpful. Essentially, whether a measure is necessary depends on whether the measure can make a material contribution to the policy objective and whether there is a less trade restrictive alternative that is reasonably available. It should be mentioned, however, that under WTO law, whether a measure is necessary for national security is to be self-judged. This does create a problem of potential abuse. Earlier this year, the United States proposed a risk-based approach to cybersecurity within the WTO. The US proposal has already been adopted by the USMCA chapter on digital trade. I think this approach reflects the necessity standard quite well. Take, for example, the Marriott data breach, the most serious data breach recently discovered. This is the most serious breach in history. The Marriott Starwood hotel chain has over 5,000 hotels in more than 110 countries. It has recently discovered unauthorized data access since 2014. The data theft may have affected more than 500 million customers around the world. How can such data theft be better prevented? Data localization requirement would not be effective because the location of the attackers are unknown. In fact, data localization requirement even increase the risk by having the data all stored in one place. In contrast, a risk-based approach can be more effective. Such approach can require the government, can be the government requirement that the business should not retain customer information longer than needed for completing a particular transaction. Actually, this kind of requirement is already in the EU's GDPR, which has a requirement at the storage period of consumer information. Just to sum up, we do badly need multilateral legal framework for cross-border data transfer, and we should do it within the WTO system. The basic principles of the WTO should be upheld, but new rules need to be enacted, which can be built upon the good provisions of the new FTAs. Given the difficulty of reaching consensus among WTO members, it is better to take a plurilateral approach towards negotiating the new framework. That is, to aim at agreement among similarly minded members. The most urgent task at the moment, however, is to summon up the collective political will of the WTO members to make necessary reform of the multilateral trading system. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Chin, for the excellent presentations. Actually, she touched upon the critical lines on the issues of the digital trade. There is a nexus between the need of government control and also the need to allow free flow of data. There is also another issue she just mentioned is that although digital trade is now developing so rapidly, the WTO rule is not in a position to handle this kind of new phenomenon. There is no rule to govern these new and emerging issues. She just indicated that actually a risk-based approach is also a necessity test. But we still don't know whether the current WTO rule could accommodate the development of these new issues. Actually, the final recommendation, the recommendation she made is also issue of discussion in this place. Whether the plurilateral approach would be a kind of a panacea, we can resolve the problem, or under what condition. We may further discuss on these issues. Thank you. I now invite Professor Dan Ikenson for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Choi. I appreciate being here. I'm honored to have been invited to participate, and I'm very happy that you all stuck around to listen to these presentations. For those of you who don't know, I'm at the Cato Institute, which is a think tank in Washington. We're nonpartisan, so we don't ally with Republicans or Democrats. We're committed to the ideals of limited government and free markets and individual liberty. I head up the Trade Center, and our commitment is to free trade and making the case for free trade and demonstrating the costs of protectionism. And by the way, Cato is named for Cato the Younger, the Roman senator who stood up to Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar was trying to turn Rome from a republic into a dictatorship. So we're grappling with our own Julius Caesar in Washington these days. And we feel pretty pleased to take up arms against this assault. So this is going to talk about the rise of China and how the U.S. has reacted to it and what the impact might be. Rather than get into the Fourth Industrial Revolution descriptions as I have here, I think previous speakers have done an excellent job laying out the characteristics of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I think Alec in the keynote gave a great overview, and he also contributed some of the backlash against globalization to the emergence of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Talked about the effect of autonomous trucks and 3D printing and other technologies on workers and how it makes them feel a bit unsettled about trade and globalization. Trade gets a lot of blame for U.S. job displacement and job loss. It turns out that most credible studies find that about 85% of U.S. job loss or job churn is attributable to technology. So that's something we need to keep in mind. Over the years, we have liberalized trade in the United States and around the world in goods. So there's more competition for people who work in factories and on farms. There's less competition so far for people who work in services industries. In fact, in 2017, Americans consumed about 4.2 trillion worth of goods, about 2.3 trillion, or 57%, was imported. So pretty good representation of imports in the domestic market. But in services, we consume 9.2 trillion, more than twice as much spending on services than on goods. But we imported $550 billion worth, just 6%. So that gives you an idea of how unopened, how closed markets are to services, and the positive benefits from specializing and trading in services. But also, it gives you an idea that only part of our populations have really been exposed to sort of the downsides of globalization. So we have a president who represents a major departure from about 85 years of U.S. trade policy history, going back to what's called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, which was legislation passed sort of in the wake of the infamous Smoot-Hawley Bill of 1930, which was a catalyst for the trade war at the time, which sent the global economy into a tailspin. Since 1934, we've had 13 presidential administrations, Republican and Democrat, and each of those presidents has supported trade liberalization. They've seen trade as an economic salve. They've seen it as a way to prevent conflagration. Yes, presidents before Trump indulged in protectionism here and there, but it was more the exception than the rule. I think President Trump sees protectionism as a way to make America great. And he has just totally changed the trajectory of the U.S. and global economy. In the name of Trump, Trump sees trade as a zero-sum game. The size of a market is fixed, and exports are our points, and imports are the foreign team's points, and the trade account is the scoreboard. And if we have a bilateral trade deficit, that means we're losing at trade, and if that bilateral trade deficit is with your country, you guys are cheating. And we're going to come after you, and we're going to renegotiate trade agreements. There's this view that U.S. manufacturing has been left in the dust because of trade. U.S. manufacturing, quite frankly, is thriving, and really always has been. There's this view that outsourcing is bad for the U.S. economy. Well, outsourcing is a very good way for U.S. businesses to remain competitive in the global economy. And it turns out, from the research that I've been doing and others have been doing, that outsourcing is really a complement to domestic production. It's not a substitute for it. In some cases, it's a substitute, and it gets a lot of attention in the media. If a factory is going to shut down and reopen abroad, be rebuilt rafter by rafter, bolt by bolt, abroad to produce for export to the United States, that's a very rare occurrence. But whenever it happens, it makes front page news. In reality, companies are outsourcing to supplement what they're doing in the domestic market, to reach out and understand foreign markets, to avail themselves of the necessary skills to produce certain products and services in other markets, to get a domestic presence. So the last point on the slide is you can detect a nationalist sort of grievance in Trump's narrative, and that is the United States is this benevolent giant. Since the end of the Second World War, we've adopted policies that enabled Europe and Asia to rebuild, and we've created this security blanket under which everybody could prosper. And what have we gotten in return? Well, the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans have all rebuilt their industries, and now they're competing with us, and they haven't showed us proper tribute. And we have the World Trade Organization, which, by the way, is so anti-American. The World Trade Organization hates the United States and always rules against us. We hear the president say that all the time. Fact is, we've looked at these numbers too. The complainant at the WTO wins about 90% of the time. The United States has been a complainant. It's won 91% of the time. When it's been a defendant, it's lost 89% of the time. Or a respondent, it's lost 89% of the time. Governments bring cases when they're pretty sure that they have a strong case, and they're going to win. So The president is promoting unilateralism to sort of overcome what he sees as shortcomings in the multilateral system. And I think that's a loss for non-discriminatory rules-based trade. We've lost the perspective also that trade and investment is an antidote to conflagration. The global supply chain era, which has helped enrich a lot of countries and reduce the prices of products around the world, I think is imperiled, is in jeopardy right now because the Trump administration is trying to encourage U.S. companies to repatriate their supply chains. Certainly that's what they're doing in China and elsewhere. And it's something that's going to be very costly. So just a quick rundown of U.S.-China economic relations before Trump. So when relations opened up in 78, 79, there was very little trade actually from China, between China and the United States. Very little U.S. investment in China. 1989, Tiananmen Square incident, and the U.S. administration of George H.W. Bush was kind of hand-wringing about what should we do, should we isolate, should we contain China, should we engage, and the engagement crowd won the debate, said, you know, if we continue to keep our markets opened and try to perpetuate a good relationship, China is going to be this vast market for us, and they're going to become more like us, and they're going to democratize, and all these other wishes. And there were frictions in the relationship after '89, between '89 and 2009. That's the 20-year period where China really rose, where there were frictions that were resolved through use of domestic trade remedies laws, like the anti-dumping law, the countervailing duty law. We had, after 2001, WTO adjudication as a channel to resolve our disputes, although I don't think the U.S. brought a case against China until 2005 or 6. There was the strategic and economic dialogue under George W. Bush. There was a strategic and economic dialogue under Obama. There's subsequent, I forget what it's called right now under Trump. It's kind of been abandoned anyway. So there were these channels for debating issues. The goal was to keep trade policy and economic policy in its own channel and not to be integrated with geopolitics and human rights and foreign policy matters. And U.S. policy basically was dictated by, there were two broad interests. I think there was the U.S. multinational community that really they were on this side, and they really wanted China to remain open, and they didn't want the United States to be too rough with China or too protectionist. And then you had the import competing industries and the labor unions here saying, yes, hit them with tariffs. You know, China's hurting the manufacturing sector, and U.S. policy kind of split the difference. And that all was working pretty reasonably well until the Great Recession in 2009 when that hit. But the tech trade war, which we're seeing right now, the technology trade war, has its origins over 10 years ago. Really, it's back in 2006, a document published by the Chinese government, a blueprint on how it was going to subsidize industries and support the Chinese tech by borrowing Western technology and doing whatever it took to get there, became public. And I think I've always attributed this to be a responsive measure to that Chinese posture. We started going after Huawei, a company that was not known so well in 2006. It attempted to buy a U.S. company called 3Com. The U.S. Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States intervened, or was going to intervene to block it, and so the parties decided to not pursue the deal. Around that time, this indigenous innovation product accreditation system was announced in China, very discriminatory, also pursuing the same sorts of objectives as that blueprint that had been discovered a couple of years earlier. Allegations about forced technology transfer started surfacing. And then the U.S. Select Committee on House Intelligence had a big hearing and a report. Huawei and ZTE asked for a public hearing about what they're all about, and these guys came up with a report that said they're terrible actors. We need to keep them out of our supply chains. U.S. carriers, the telecom carriers, were advised not to purchase any products from these companies. A year or two later, a continuing budget resolution was passed, which made it illegal for U.S. government agencies, certain U.S. government agencies, to purchase any products that had Huawei or ZTE gear in them. The problem that I had with these indictments is that all of the information was classified and remains classified to this day. I'm not necessarily doubting that maybe there's some malfeasance or some bad actions that have taken place with some of these companies, but I'm sure it's been blown out of proportion, and now we've got a really serious problem with it. I think this has all been a response to China's techno-mercantilism that I mentioned before. So these efforts have failed to compel China to change. In 2015, a new investment of $16 billion was announced to have indigenous semiconductor production in China. I mean, we have been invoking national security to impose duties on steel and aluminum. To China, its dependence on high-end semiconductors is a real legitimate national security issue. So they announced this plan. In 2015, the Made in China 2025 was unveiled. The national security law went into effect. A year later, the cybersecurity law, which to the U.S. and a lot of other Western companies seemed entirely arbitrary and seemed to subject these companies to sort of random requests for technology to turn over source code, to do all sorts of things to appease and satisfy Chinese customs authorities. The U.S. President's Council on Science and Technology put out a big report warning of the impact of China's push into various technologies, and that the United States was falling behind and we should do something about it. And then in 2018, just this past summer, we revised the CFIUS law, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which evaluates prospective acquisitions of U.S. companies, made it more rigorous, expanded the scope, and it passed resoundingly in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, it was 85-10. In the House, it was 400-2. So there is some broad bipartisan support for cracking down on China. This is not just Trump. This predates Trump. Let me just make sure I'm staying close to on time here. There is this view that China has gone too far, and that that the president has decided we're going to pursue Section 301, which is this law that he's using to the tariffs that have been imposed on China so far are being implemented under this law, which is a law that the U.S. is really not supposed to be using. When the WTO was founded and we joined the WTO, we agreed not to be judge, jury, and executioner. But a narrative that has taken hold in Washington is that the WTO is feckless. It can't help to rein in Chinese practices. We need to take matters into our own hands. I don't think that the premise has been tested. There have been about 30 or 40, maybe 40 cases, 30, I forget if it was 30 or 40 cases brought against China. At the WTO, about half of them, slightly under half, have been adjudicated, and in almost every one of those cases, China has come into compliance or is trying to come into compliance. The question is whether or not it is violating the letter of the WTO rules or not. It certainly appears to me that they're violating the spirit, in which case the United States shouldn't be doing this alone. It should be standing shoulder to shoulder with the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans and confronting that way. I think I'll just sum this up. This boils down to perceptions. And the China that we chose to engage with in 1989 was a poor country trying to overcome years of just deleterious, terrible policies. The China of today is different. The president of China is president for life. The Great Firewall of China is thickening. Mass surveillance is underway in China. There are re-education camps in Western China. There are a slew of bad actions that are making it very easy for U.S. policymakers to conclude that we have to go head-to-head with China and forget the world trading system. Let me just, a lot of the stuff maybe we need to get to in the Q&A. A little more time? Okay. Yeah, as I said, yeah, 400 to 2 was the vote in the House, 85 to 10 in the Senate. I don't think that Hillary Clinton, had she won the election, I don't think her policy would be much different than Trump's. There is this view that that China is trying to leapfrog the United States to the technological fore. What does that mean? There are a lot of first mover advantages when you're the first in a particular technology. Has military and defense implications. And I don't know that there's any putting this genie back in the bottle. I think the president's misguided focus on bilateral trade deficits is a problem. But in order to convince the Chinese that the United States is unhappy with its policies, it is imposing these tariffs. Who's it hurting? Well, it's certainly hurting Americans. It's hurting a lot of U.S. businesses. It's hurting U.S. farmers. And it's hurting the Chinese. Some people in the United States see this as an existential thing. And they've been told, you know, you have to take these tariffs. We gave you large tax cuts. Take these tariffs. It's almost like when General Eisenhower and the other generals in the Allied forces were drawing up D-Day plans for Europe in 1944. They knew people were going to die on the beach, but there was a bigger mission here. And I think that there's still a lot of Americans who see this as an existential thing, and they're willing to tolerate some level of tariffs. The problem is the U.S. is also, like I said, they're trying to repatriate their supply chains. They're also trying to encourage other governments to repatriate their supply chains. I'm sure they would like to see the Koreans divert their supply chains from China, and the Canadians, and the Australians, and the Kiwis, and the Singaporeans. These governments, these people don't want to have to choose between the United States and China, but that's what they're going to be asked to do. Right now, there's a lot of pressure on the Canadians because they've arrested that Huawei executive. Chinese are putting pressure on Canada, not really on the United States. There are a lot of situations in which pressure is going to be put on other governments to make a choice, and I think that's a problem which suggests that protectionism is going to hold and endure, that the global economy is going to bifurcate. There's going to be this Cold War sort of a mentality that persists for a while, where the Chinese are buying off governments, expanding their One Belt, One Road project. The United States is convincing governments that they need to be on the right side of history. I don't know exactly how this ends, and you know, there could be some agreements on trade issues, but if you're talking about technology and we don't trust one another, and I don't see how we come to an agreement on that. I don't see how the WTO or the multilateral system has a major role to play there, because in order for the WTO to work more effectively to rein in this tech trade war, it needs to take some sovereignty away from the United States and China. And I don't think either of those governments is going to do anything approaching that. So I think we're just going to have to sort of manage this for a little while. Anyway, there's more to this that maybe we'll get to in the Q&A. I wanted to stop there. These are the takeaways. I'll look at them in my notes, so if it comes up in Q&A. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan, for your presentation. Actually, the history of U.S. Trade policy development, particularly the characteristics of President Trump's America First trade policy, which have far-reaching implications to United States, China, and other third countries, and also the multilateral trading system. And U.S. new trade policy is not the creation of President Trump himself, but it's kind of bipartisan agreement in the United States. And actually, the question you just raised, whether China would be a responsible member of the international community to follow the international rule which have been agreed by members. You are rather more pessimistic on the operation of WTO in addressing these key issues, but we may discuss the WTO reform issues at a later stage. Now I would like to invite Professor An for discussions.
Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity. I sincerely thank Minister of Foreign Affairs and KNDA. Following up the brilliant presentation by Julia and Dan, let me emphasize that this is an area to the digital trade or e-commerce or the tech trade area will be an area to observe the major trade battle between US and China in the coming years. Actually, it reminds me of the past history. In the middle of the 1980s, when we launched Uruguay round of negotiation, at that time, incidentally, that was the time I began to study international economics. Economists wondered what was services trade, because no international economic theory ever explained the services trade. And no economist understood how to measure even the services trade. But the outcome was a subsector of 155 of services industries are all covered under so-called GATS agreement. Now we talk about the digital trade. Situation is very similar. We don't understand how to measure even digital trade. In fact, we still have a huge controversy about the concept or definition of the digital trade issue, because in the US, normally we try to adopt the commodity trade concept. Typically, digital product is accepted to start the discussions. That is how, in FTA, normally the US government try to include the digital part. European Union actually adopt a completely different approach. In EU FTA, if you look at the Korea-EU FTA, for example, then e-commerce issue is actually linked with the services trade. So the approach between US and European unions are actually very different. So under that circumstance, we are talking about the digital trade. Probably we will see completely unprecedented the rule about the digital trade sooner or later, because that is what the so-called WTO reform initiative is trying to address. In that regard, it is quite noteworthy to see what actually happened in the USMCA, very recently agreed among Canada and Mexico. In fact, when TPP negotiation was concluded, we were very surprised. E-commerce chapter, out of nowhere, suddenly have hugely elaborated provisions there. Before than that, even when Korea and United States concluded FTA, e-commerce chapter simply has just a few provisions. Typically says we will not impose any tariff for digital trade, e-commerce trade. That was it, pretty much. But suddenly, data free flow, provision of the server localization, even online consumer protections, all those very articulated regulations were adopted in the TPP document. Now, USMCA adopted TPP plus languages there. It even included like interactive consumer computer services. Also, for location of computer facilities, in TPP, we try to allow some kind of the public policy exceptions. When government try to address legitimate public policy objectives, then they try to allow some kind of exceptions. In USMCA, nothing. Server localization is completely prohibited, whatever that means. So this kind of very strong languages were now introduced into USMCA, and now US government is talking to Japan and European Union about the potential FTA negotiations. It means in the WTO, sooner or later, probably USMCA digital trade chapter. By the way, that was the first time that in FTA you have this terminology, digital trade. Always we talk about e-commerce, but suddenly USMCA has a chapter about digital trade. Probably in the WTO, even USMCA or USMCA plus languages will be probably imposed by US or US ally countries, along with Japan, EU, and other countries. Then, as Julia nicely explained, under that backdrop, we have another huge potential possibility to see massive confrontation between US and China. Because China just passed cyber security law last year, but there they strengthened the regulation to allow data free flow restrictions and the server localization requirement and so forth. They are going completely opposite way against basically the huge direction the US government is imposing. So that worry me at least to see actually next year or in the coming years or months, probably we will have another menu list to provoke two countries in terms of the potential trade war. Another the dangerous element is US government, as we can see, does not engage China. In fact, the China has one of the largest probably cyber or digital trade markets with numerous internet users. But intentionally, US government exclude China from whatever kind of discussion for digital trade negotiations. China is not invited into TPP, is not invited into TISA, is not invited to any kind of the US-led initiative to prepare the foundation for the future digital trade, the framework. So basically the option for China is take it or leave it. That raises another huge problem in the coming years, because still in China, Google is not allowed, Facebook is not allowed. There is a long way to go to accept the current initiatives. Finally, very briefly, what about then Korea? Are we doing okay? I don't think so. We do have a lot of issues. In Korea, we always boast, or we are very confident about IT champion country, IT 강국. I don't know what that means, but we believe we are very strong in terms of the IT industry sector. So whenever we have this digital trade issue, our government always trying to go very at the front to lead the discussion or to join this initiative. But the reality, Korea is one of the very few countries, to my knowledge, this is the only country in the OECD which does not allow the Google Map properly. Google Map is not working. Sorry for our international guest. Because it causes huge inconvenience for our international guests. And then Uber, Airbnb, or the mobile payments are not working properly in Korea. So this is the current reality here. that raises a huge issue. For digital trade, probably one of the very foundational the principle we nowadays impose is data free flow. Data free flow is very strong and one of the core elements for digital trade. And in the USMCA, they did not even exclude financial information exceptions. So basically, every kind of data now must be flowed freely. In Korea, we do not have such kind of the regulatory systems. Financial informations are strictly regulated. Even medical services, medical informations are very strictly regulated. So we do have a lot of issue for the distance diagnosis or medical service industry development because of this, the personal information protection issue. So for Korea, we also have lots of homework list and how to handle this digital issue or fourth revolution, whatever issue, will be a big challenge for the government policy in the coming years. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Anna. Now I invite Professor Che for your discussions.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. This session topic is world economy goes under duress. So I'd like to put my discussion in the context. But first of all, I'll start with sharing my negotiating memory back in early 1990s. I was Korean service trade negotiators for Uruguay rounds. Also, I was the one who negotiated telecom annex. Perhaps I was the one and only who negotiated from the beginning to the end telecom annex. And back then, even though we talk about service, as Professor An mentioned, maybe he was students, and we basically tried to make 1 out of 0, so very challenging. And I recall early days Geneva that we discussing what the hell is trade and service. So all this mode of delivery, 1, 2, 3, 4 is some outcome of negotiations and compromise, not outcome of academic contest. So that is something very important to know, because whatever we have at the end of all these negotiations, one thing I realized from years of my negotiation is we are not out there to compete and share intellectual sophistications. Usually I realize big country, they try to push based on their domestic interest. So that's the outcome. And back then, I think no one in that room in Geneva was even, they think about possibility of maybe quarter century later's digital trade. So for that reason, I think, we are very much open-minded technology neutrality, even though you try to assail it. Another one is, it was evident back then, I think December 1993, so just, the 15 days to go, the deadline. And if my recollection is correct, all this negotiating draft, we had 15 agendas, so to speak, and one was creation of new trade organization. It was named as MTO, Creation of Multilateral Trade Organizations. But we don't have MTO, we have World Trade Organization. Do you know why? Because the US resisted the using of multilateral. Because I realized that country is not interested in having multilateral system, unilateral system or bilateral system, and so on and so forth. So even though we kept saying global trading system, we have been enjoying for years rule-based free trade, underpinned by multilateral trading system, but the evidence is quite there. If USA is willing to use their power, then they could break. So I think there is situation. So what is happening right now in past 2 years since election of Donald Trump as president? While my jargon is we're witnessing arrival of new normal, because old normal was basically rule-based free trade underpinned by WTO or GATT. A new normal is we don't see that much rule-based system, power-based system, especially between two biggest economies in the world. And you don't see that much free trade. You see the managed trade. Evidence, well, chorus renegotiations, very much the managed trade. And NAFTA 2.0, USMCA is the bona fide example of managed trade, rule of origin, automobile, and interference in domestic economies. You should have at least 70% of work done by hourly wage, $16 a day. I haven't seen anything like that. Okay, and so all this. So all of a sudden, we are into deep territory of new normal. The question is whether or not this new normal will continue. And I'll argue this new normal is with us for a while, for the following reason. I'll explain later. And well, I think the best evidence of new normal is ongoing US-China trade war. Because if WTO is working effectively, for instance, even if US is accusing violation IPR, then I think they have all confidence of going through WTO dispute settlement system. But they're not doing it. Because on part of Donald Trump, strategic, that he realized all time consuming, at the end of the day, his time is up, and China will go on. So very much strategic. But in deepest of decision is he doesn't trust. I think his people around him, they don't trust WTO. So in a sense, WTO is bypassed or surpassed. Also, the two leaders of two biggest economies in the world, they have no trust about existing WTO system. So I think that's the questions. And one of presumption is, then it is all because of Donald Trump. Well, I don't think so. Because problem was there, and so-called unique economic system, which you call Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristic. I don't call it state capitalism. I call it socialism Chinese characteristic. They experimenting with some element of market economy. But somehow global community, they couldn't handle effectively this problem. And it may be evident China is not responsible stakeholders, but I don't think that much collective will was on Western powers. And then what is the main difference between prior to Donald Trump? For instance, 8 years of President Obama, he was aware of the problem, but he still sort of conventional guy. He relied on alliance, and he was willing to go through WTO and waste of time. Now, all this power elite in Washington, they realize we're wasting time, and time is up, and China is almost up to our chins. And unless we're going to contain, isolate China, our time is going to go over. So that's sort of sense of urgency, perhaps related to so-called to see the trap in the language of very famous international scholars. I think that is what is happening. So having said that, what is happening in global economic orders while we are making break with so-called liberal international order, and we have so-called new trade security nexus. Existing trade security nexus, the way I see it was, for instance, in 70 years of running it, I think there was a huge firewall between security issues and trade issues. For instance, between airlines, between Brussels, Washington, between Seoul and Washington, and Doha and Washington, even though they have serious trade problem, I think all days they had confidence. They could go all the way to negotiate, even though to make the other people blush, but they had confidence it is not going to compromise the security arrangement. But that is gone. So that is new normal. So new normal is now, perhaps at the end of the Cold War, now we have situations, security and trade, they're on same strategic space. And evidence, well, 2017, December 18, the new security strategy report released by Trump administrations, they identify China as not strategic partner, strategic competitors. And also they identified economic security the same as political security. So I think this is the way we are in, and I think this will go all the way. I'd like to point out important role played by technology, because people tend to sidestep important technology, but technology is playing a very central role. How does it play? For instance, if you recall 1990s ICT revolution, information technology revolutions, Because of ITC revolutions, global community, for the first time, they had a truly global value chain. Example, iPhone, designed California's, assembled in China, but all important parts and components are procured from all over the world, exported to USA. But the problem was, the more consolidation and full running of global value chains, so-called factory China model, it is going to create problem. Because one of the reasons why Donald Trump was winning election was he appealed to his Rust Belt voters. And your problem is not because of, your problem is basically because of free trade and all previous administration. They simply let China come to global trading system. So this information technology, ICT, which played consolidation of global value chain, but very ironically, somehow it spelled downfall of old normal. And to make matters much more complicated, now we have digital transformations, today's topic, fourth industrial revolutions. It has much more different element. And because as far as digital transformation is concerned, many countries, they believe they are in the same starting line. And precisely because of that, Chinese power elite, they believe they are given historical chance to get even through leapfrogging. And so that is so-called Made in China 2025. I don't think China will back down. They will go all the way. And so my prediction is, no matter what happens, at the end of 90 days so-called trade truce, no matter what happens, China will continue to move down their own path. And whatever US try to do is going to be stopped short of, maybe they could delay China's ambitions. For instance, AI. Chinese scholars are telling me that they have very natural advantage because of big data, they have 1.4 billions. This data is new oils. And China happened to be Saudi Arabia's of data. So, outmatch. And so as long as US leadership is not totally organized and the domestic politics is not going to be effectively functional, and they may try to delay China's ambitions, but it's not going to stop. Then what is the implications? And I'm very pessimistic about possibility of the reform. It's not going to happen. Don't be mistaken. It's not going to happen. Because, as you mentioned, previous two speakers, we have several issues outside of WTO, digital trade, SOEs, subsidy, and cybersecurity, all those important issues, but they're so interrelated. But as Professor An mentioned, China is not either invited to discussions, maybe they're interested in joint discussions, because they believe current discussion is being shaped by US, and probably in conjunction with EU. So, having said that, what's likely to happen is we're going to have at least 2 or 3 different fragmented models. One is US-driven supply models. Another one is EU-driven consumer protection model for digital trade. But maybe eventually, I believe, except digital trade, some other issues, EU will take side with the US side. And that means you will have US-centered system for new global economy and China-centered system. Question is, countries like South Korea's, ASEAN's, or Latin America's, Africa's, what they're going to do. So, as it turns out, more stakes and more consequence is going to be felt by those countries standing in the line. So, brace your So I'd like to conclude, actually, the sort of observation and also questions to Dan. Well, according to your analysis, Trump understands only one language, not economics, but zero-sum game powers. And I tend to believe, even if he's going to be re-elected, he will continue to push down current policy. And so I'd like to hear your view, whether he's going to continue his push down his policy. And second really question is, even if Trump is gone and there will be new US president, given current environment, given the domestic politics and given technological cleavage, I think China bashing will continue, and so this so-called new normal will be stay with us for a while. So that is my assessment. I'd like to hear from you. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chair, for your comments and discussions. Before I open the floor, I just would like to share two questions raised by. Actually, I think this question was collected from internet. They just delivered to me two questions. One is already spoken by Professor Chair. How long does U.S.-China conflict would continue? Actually, you may answer the question even after the term of the President Trump. Actually, similar question relating to that is that considering the difference of economic system between China, which is state-controlled capitalism, and the market-driven economy of the United States, is there any possibility to compromise these two different systems? Is there any actually viable ways to accommodate these two different systems in order to make a multilateral trading system functional? It's a very tricky question. Second question is relating to the WTO reform. Considering that U.S. trade policy vis-a-vis China would have been changed from accommodation and engagement to containment and isolation. And so long as the United States maintain this kind of trade policy towards China, can these two giants work together peacefully in the WTO to make new trade rules? Actually, those are two questions. I think this either one of the panelists would respond. And now I just would like to invite questions from the floor. Okay, a gentleman from behind.
중앙대학교 강철승 교수입니다. 미중 간의 큰 문제점은 그 정치 체제의 그 차이에서 크게 여러 가지를 함축하는 의미가 깊다고 생각하는데, 예를 들어서 시진핑은 중국은 영구 집권으로 그 정치를 유지를 하기 때문에 계획 경제 시스템을 모든 것을 중국이 의도하는 대로 계속 나갈 것으로 생각하고, 그렇지만은 자유주의형에 있는 트럼프를 비롯해서 우리 자유주의형에 있는 모든 여러 국가들은 그 선거를 통해서 임기가 대통령이 지도자가 바뀌기 때문에 그런 것들을 우리가 김정은이도 마찬가지지만은 그런 그 차이를 할 때 절대로 중국은 포기를 하지 않을 것이고, 또 중국은 미국의 그 국채를 제일 많이 가지고 있는 나라기 때문에 미국이 그렇게 한다 손 치더라도 미국이 이 정권이 자꾸 바뀌는 이런 상황에서 세계 무역 전쟁에서 봐보면은 중국은 아프리카나 어디나 가서 많은 자금으로 계획된 대로 자기들이 하고 있는데, 이것을 자유주의형 체제에서 중국을 합리적으로 하는 그런 방법들이 어떤 것이 있겠는가, 그것이 통하겠는가, 그런 것에 대해서 우리 설명을 해주셨으면 좋겠습니다.
예, 한 번 질문 더 받겠습니다. 없으시면 먼저 지금 한번 first round를 한번 돌려보고, actually we have around 20 minutes. Now I just would like to ask each panelist to respond, and then we can go one second round.
Well, I'll give it a shot. These questions all have similar themes, and that is that we're in this trade war, and how is it going to end? Is there any way to, for it to end? I'm not very optimistic. I think the technology issues and the Chinese effort to leapfrog the United States and American efforts to prevent that from happening are going to make it very difficult for the ICT supply chains and other technology supply chains to continue. You know, a lot of the rare earths that are used in these products come from China. The supply chain goes back and forth between China and the United States and other countries around the world. So everybody has a little piece of the action there. I mean, one thing that we're mulling over is the idea of, and I wrote this paper, which we didn't publish yet because of what happened this year with the relationship, and that is trying to pursue a bilateral trade agreement between the United States and China. Now that sounds kind of ridiculous after what I've just said, but to focus on the parts of the relationship that could work. Can we sequester? Can we isolate the technology issues? China, you know, at the meeting in Argentina and at other meetings this year, there have been promises of China opening more of its investment market, more of its procurement market. There have been funny commitments about lowering tariffs on U.S. automobiles. I don't know how China can do that without lowering them on everybody. But if you have an agreement, if it's in a bilateral trade agreement or a bilateral investment treaty or something like that, let's see what we can agree on. It's almost like marriage counseling. You know, you have a husband and a wife trying to figure out how to minimize the differences. That can be done. In response to the question from the gentleman in the audience, you know, China doesn't want to go it alone. China can tap into resources in Africa and other developing countries. Ultimately, it needs markets also to sell into. And if there's unity among the liberalist countries, as you described them, to stand up to China and compel it to act within the rules. I think the big gripe is that China has thrived under the rules that were created by the West and is now sort of abusing them. That's a narrative. Look, a lot of governments violate the rules, you know, including the United States. And the United States has not been very good at coming into compliance, you know, right away when it's violating its WTO commitments. But I think China would react differently to a situation in which the United States is standing with the Koreans and the Europeans and the Japanese and the Australians and the Canadians complaining about the same thing. Instead, Trump went about it this way. He decided to slap steel and aluminum tariffs on all of our allies, anger all of our allies, then declare trade war on China. And so China perceives the dynamics as a great power game, just one-on-one. When had we gone about this differently? Had we not bailed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? I mean, I think that was a very, very big mistake. That would have put economic pressure, I think, on China as more and more of its trading partners signed on to this preferential agreement. It would have been on the outside looking in. I had written a couple of years ago that I thought China would definitely want in. It wouldn't be called the TPP. It would have been called, you know, the Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific or something. But it's this tech thing that really worries. It's not just China's transgressions or alleged transgressions. It's the way the United States perceives of it. We are the global hegemon. We are the incumbent power. There is the, you know, the abused metaphor of Thucydides' trap. and China is rising, and the United States is going to react differently than Korea or Australia or Singapore would because of the responsibilities, for better or worse, that we have taken on. In Graham Allison's book, Destined for War, where he talks about Thucydides' trap, and for those of you who don't know, the ancient Greek historian who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, and he's done a study, and I forget how many, it's 16 cases, I think, in 12 cases of Thucydides' trap situations where a challenger is confronting a powerful incumbent. War was the result. 4 times it wasn't, and what those situations had in common, I think, was a few things, one of which was a reliance on some sort of international institution or pact. So maybe there is a role for the WTO, and maybe there is a role for the G20. I just know that a headstrong China and a headstrong United States is not going to allow its sovereignty to be reined in if it doesn't want it to be. Anyway, I came here hoping that I'd be cheered up by you guys. I'll turn it over to Julia.
Well, a couple of points maybe of my own thoughts. One thing is, I think that the Chinese people and the government were pretty shocked how this trade war has turned out. Not very long ago, Xi Jinping was making this big speech, and sort of he saw himself as the new globalization leader, right, when the United States went the other way. And within a short period of a few months after Trump started the trade war, it's like China found out all of a sudden like it has no friend left. Despite the billions and billions of dollars spread around the world on bad-enrolled countries, I don't think the Chinese believe that they have genuine friends that can be bought with money. I want to make another point, which is, I guess, related to that one is, I totally agree with Dan. It's counterproductive to demonize China. The fact that the Chinese are very much shocked had to do with how much they believe they actually belong to the globalized system. China has benefited tremendously from the WTO because of the opening up and integration into global economy that really made the Chinese comparative advantage in the last 2 decades. Just tremendous, unprecedented problem in human history, how much you can lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China's very proud of it. And then I think even Xi Jinping himself, despite how contradictory it might be, he genuinely believed that he's going to be a globalization promoter, and he wanted to be the global leader for whatever he thinks that global leader should do. So to demonize China, and there's a lot of talk recently in the U.S., the trade circle, how can we kick China out of the WTO? There's no rule there that how can you dispel a member. So I think that it doesn't help at all, because there are a lot of people who really like to have this global system, as Dan pointed out. For all these WTO involved, the litigation in which China was sued, most of those were sued by the United States and EU and some other countries. 90% of chance China, no more than 19% of the time, China lost those litigation. However, China has had a much better, if you look at the record, much better record than the United States in terms of complying with the WTO decisions in the dispute. So I think WTO has been underutilized when it comes to China complying with the rules, and the United States, for example, could have sued China long ago over the Google issue on these technology transfer, because there is actually provision in the China Accession Protocol, particularly prohibiting China from requiring transfer of technology as a condition for doing business in China. No other country within the WTO has that kind of commitment. And that has not been used at all. So that is one point, essentially, how can we have the coexistence of China and the rest of the free economy, free market economy countries? My point is it has not been fully utilized. The current rules have not been fully utilized. That's one thing. The other thing is I want to say China is a huge country. Many, many people in China do not necessarily agree with the current administration politically. And also, currently, the domestic economic system is under huge stress. Private economy has been squeezed, especially under the trade war, actually. A lot of the private businesses go bankrupt because their profit is only like 2%, 3% margin, and you have 10% tax on it, additional tariff on it, they go out. So they ended up being acquired by the state-owned enterprises. Those are the good, that's the fortunate ones, which exactly have the opposite effect, which is the trade war actually squeeze out more private economics enterprises in China and then force the state-owned become stronger. Well, I guess the only thing that I can say about being optimistic is to say that I've long stopped predicting what's going to happen in China, because the only thing is pretty much like President Trump. The only thing that's predictable about China is unpredictable. So that is the only thing I can say to stay optimistic.
Actually, United States trade policy is also unpredictable. No, it's just a joke. As any one of the discussants, Professor Che? Yeah.
Well, of course, it is counterproductive to demonize China. No one is demonizing. It is based on fact. I will talk based on fact. Also, I'd like to raise a question about a very counterproductive U.S. trade policy. First of all, regarding China, for instance, there is one items out of 10 designated China's made in 2025, electric vehicle. And for electric vehicle, battery is essential. And Chinese government right now, they have a huge subsidy program for electric vehicle battery. And Korean company, they are leading edge of electric car battery. And all Korean companies, because they believe Chinese government promised to give subsidy, battery, they put tons of money in China and they build factories. And what is happening was, except very few early months, none of those Korean battery company was given any subsidy. It is mainly because Chinese government keep changing their regulation. It's funny because company at state-art technology was not given any subsidy. So I think that is why people criticizing China is a tilting playground for the benefit of their home champions. So I think the jury is out there, because that issue is not going to be something can be resolved through WTO. Because WTO is silent on foreign direct investment, WTO is silent on many important digital transformation issues. So if you keep saying that WTO is a win-win and all this record, I think you are not really facing the issues. And also US. I think what Trump is doing is he's treading on very dangerous territory, because even if he tried to focus on pushing China, so that to change their policy, but a lot of people, they believe it is going to be counterproductive is he's not utilizing effectively so-called like-minded, like-value countries like allies. And evidence is early this year, the imposition of Section 232 on steel. At the end of the day, what was happening was all steel exporting countries to the US, they given 25% tariff based on national security threat. But Korean case was very, very exceptional and very interesting because according to Plan B, as prepared by Department of Commerce, they identify so-called 12 rogue state, which is giving too much problem to the U.S. when it comes to steel. And so Commerce Department, they suggested for those 12 countries, Trump should levy 54%. And usual suspect, including Russia, China, Korea was there. So I don't see any justifications under which, the military alliance, economic alliance, and also country join USA for all this, war against terrorism, somehow designate as those, 12 rogue states. I think this is what is happening. So unless, he's going to reorient his policy and too much reliance on Section 232 to reshape global trading regime, this is absolutely counterproductive.
Very briefly, 2 points. One is the China this year, actually the first quarter, the Chinese economy, for the first time during maybe a few decades, scored the negative, the current account balance. Even a few years ago, we talked about the global imbalance. Basically, that language was invented to mean, nicely, enormous scale trade surplus of China. First quarter of this year, Chinese economy scored current account deficit. And maybe by the end of this year, China will score probably a little bit of the positive number. But the unimaginable scale of current account, the surplus, is now the history. So economically, actually, we have completely different situations. And then the problem is bilateral commodity trade surplus against the United States is keep increasing. That is why a lot of the trade experts worry about exchange rate, currency trouble next year. So systematically slow down. So next year will be probably the critical timings. So globally or macroeconomically speaking, the economic fundamental seems to be recovered from the global financial crisis. So actually, since the last year, IMF and all other international organizations estimated the economic boom or growth for the global economies. But suddenly, completely unexpectedly, this trade war between US and China have caused some unexpected problems. But next year, whether these two countries can handle this situation or it will be more aggravated, probably will turn the whole direction of the global economic situation. So something very important to come. I hope China and US can find some resolution before too late.
Yeah. Now I would like to open the floor as a second round. Okay, the gentleman behind over there. We have just 5 minutes. Therefore, just make your question as concise as possible.
Thank you. Sorry. As most of the panels have mentioned, with both Xi and Trump playing up the strongman narrative, two clashing economic orders seem inevitable, with China leading the new order and US trying to keep up with the existing order. How should Korea reap the benefits of China's economic potential while maintaining its long-standing ally with the US? I know some of you guys have touched on it, but would any of the panelists would care to elaborate on the question? Thank you.
Okay, another question.
예, 저기는 지금까지 제시되지 않은 다른 하나 이슈를 제시하고 싶은데요. 지금 현재 미중 전쟁에는 이런 트레이드 이슈도 있지만 사실 북핵 이슈도 크게 관련이 돼 있지 않나 생각이 됩니다. 거기에 대해서 코멘트 좀 해주시죠.
무슨 이슈요? 잘 못 들었습니다.
미중 전쟁의 한 요인은 북핵 문제를 어떻게 할 것인가 하는 문제가 상식적으로 추론이 되지 않습니까? 사실 그 북핵 문제를 해결하려면 중국의 역할이 큰데 그 문제를 지금까지 말씀을 안 해주셔서 좀 말씀을 해주시면 고맙겠습니다.
Okay, the last question from the far behind.
예, 말씀 잘 들었습니다. 그 데이터 관련해서 말씀들을 하셨는데요. 저희는 심각하게 보고 있는 것 중에 하나가 그 데이터의 불균형, 불평등, 독점 이런 것들이 이제 앞으로 세계적인 문제가 될 거라고 보고 현재 이제 유럽 쪽에서도 미국의 데이터의 독점 현상에 대해서 이제 제동을 걸고 있는 현상이 나타나고 있는데 지금 현재 이제 데이터 세계 이제 그 뭐 IT 데이터 공룡이라고 얘기하는 그 사람들이 실제는 이제 부의 전체 뭐 한 90% 이상을 가져가는 그런 기업이 됐습니다. 점차 이제 데이터 이제 중심에 이제 부가 쏠리고 있는데 지금 세계의 문제가 지금 데이터의 그 프리 그 문제는 힘 있는 사람들의 얘기고요. 데이터를 그 못 가진 사람들이 부가 점점적으로 편중되기 때문에 부의 불균형으로 인한 그 정말 이제 옛날에 뭐 게르만인 민족 대이동처럼 지금 남미에서도 이동하고 아프리카에서 이동을 하는데 지금 그 문제가 심각하게 지금 앞으로 대두될 거라고 보는데 거기에 대해서 데이터의 불균형이나 어떤 부의 불평등에 대한 문제를 한번 코멘트를 좀 받아봤으면 좋겠습니다.
Okay, now I close the questions from the floor, and I just would like to invite each individual panelist to respond. Who will? Okay, you will be first.
I'll give it a shot. I'll respond to that first question about what Korea should do. Tread lightly. You know, I imagine, or maybe I should say, play hard to get. I think China and the United States will be soliciting Korea. If Korea plays it right, it's maybe in a pretty decent position. But yeah, you know, you have to be aware of U.S. behavior. It's been engaging in sort of extraterritorial measures to try to compel countries to do what it wants. The USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0, has a provision in it that if any party wants to negotiate it with a country that's considered a non-market economy as of the date of the signing of that trade agreement, has to seek counsel from the other members. You know, so I think that there'll be sort of Cold War tactics to try to make it difficult for Korea to do both, but Korea needs to figure out a way to do that. On the North Korean issue, North Korean trade, you know, the Trump administration has sort of two different heads on the China trade war. Trump's instinct, and I think in this camp are Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and Larry Kudlow. They're more transactional. They want a deal. Let's have a deal, meaning Xi agrees to buy a bunch of ag products or energy products, and then hey, we'll call it a day, and the trade war is over. I think that camp also sees North Korea sees China helping out on the North Korea issue as relevant, but there are the real security hawks. There's there's Lighthizer, Navarro, and then there's the U.S. Security Commission, and a lot of right-of-center policymakers who see the real long-term problem, and that is the techno-nationalism. So I don't think that the Chinese assistance with respect to North Korea necessarily assuages them on that issue. So those are my 2 cents on those two questions.
Okay, who would respond on this data monopoly issues? So another tricky issues.
Well, I think it's an excellent question on the data inequality. I would like to say within the WTO, that's an issue that has been raised, right? Discussed, and developing countries are very worried about this issue, and then how to bridge the digital divide has been a topic for years, as far as I can recall, and Ambassador Che probably can give us more on that one. I just remember one point. It's not exactly this round of question from the floor, but I just wanted to add one more thought on the China issue. This current tariff war, the trade war, actually has been generally perceived, at least by the intellectual circle in China, or a lot of the trade economists and legal experts, as the way to deepen domestic economic reform. This may sound for a lot of outsiders as kind of contradictory to where China is heading. But I think that many people have realized, at least within China, the US trade war has become an external check on China in terms of where China should go. The WTO accession was perceived as external pressure under which China was able to deepen its reform, which led to the decade of economic miracle. And this trade war has increasingly been perceived as another external pressure, although this time it's not really China voluntarily sought this kind of pressure, but it has been perceived as an opportunity for China to do something which is necessary for its domestic reform, not because of something external. So I think to stay reasonably optimistic, I think that we should pay attention to this realization within the Chinese elites, at least.
Thank you. Final word from Professor An or Professor Che?
Very briefly on China issues. I think Korean government should try two things. First of all, they have to make most of effort to ensure China will stay on the course, reform and opening up, even though it may be very incremental, slow pace. It's much better than China reverting back to older days. And second thing is, in the light of, but quite visible risk, security risk, again, Korean government should join other countries, make sure China is not going to fall into trouble using too much geoeconomics. And on those Korean issues which gentleman was asking, I was in Washington, D.C. last week, but it is too confidential to say in the public. So if you approach me after break, and perhaps I can tell you in private. Thank you.
Okay, actually we already spent the time allowed to us. We have discussed a lot of important discussions, and actually the issue is very complex, and we may have another round of discussions or sessions to deal with these issues. We have a lot of things actually to discuss more, but we have to stop here. Actually, we have no time. So I would like to close our session here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for informative presentation and discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a big round of applause once again. This is the end of the second session. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of the second session of today's conference. After a short break, the roundtable session will begin at 4:35. Thank you.